My colleague, who also happens to be my dear husband, and I have been working on our own game, a text-based RPG called Emerald Ferns. In this video, I want to talk about two problems that I believe have plagued the RPG genre for a very long time. Problems that ultimately inspired us to start this project, and about how we're going to solve them or at least try. Act 1. Not enough options. This one is obvious to many. Players regularly find themselves in situations where the list of dialogue options doesn't include what they actually want to say. They want to say or do something that developers didn't anticipate, and they feel frustrated. You can hear this complaint from all kinds of sources every time an RPG comes up in a conversation. If you look at it broadly, this whole thing essentially boils down to the problem of not having enough response options. I'll try to figure out why it's really that simple, how could it theoretically be solved, and why it hasn't been solved yet. Given how obvious the problem is, we've of course already seen a number of attempts to fix it. Many of them involve artificial intelligence, and virtually all of them end up rather poorly. I'll talk about two fairly radical examples, two extremes that illustrate all of the nuances and shortcomings of such approaches. The first extreme is something like the AI NPC mode for Skyrim, where the player can say anything they want to a non-player character using their voice, and the AI controlling that NPC tries to come up with some appropriate response. And right away we run into a series of side effects. The moment you remove the control over the player that pre-written options provide, it turns out they can accidentally offer a passing joke, say something completely irrelevant, instantly ruining their entire future experience with the game. They can walk up to Fandel and ask, "What is your favorite Pokemon?" And just by saying that out loud, they've already knocked themselves out of this world's reality. And then, hearing the AI's attempts to somehow respond to this absurd line, we end up in a situation where the game itself is spitting out strange, out-of-place phrases and openly showing that it's confused and has no idea what's going on. Everything that follows in this universe becomes nothing more than comical and broken. The second thing worth noting, mods like this are purely cosmetic. Even when the player doesn't say anything inappropriate, still none of it will affect the story. It won't even nudge the progress of the smallest local quests. You're still going to do everything the usual way, and the mod doesn't interact with the actual gameplay at all. It's important to clarify here, I'm not saying that being cosmetic is inherently bad. The problem is specifically that this kind of implementation is disconnected from the real dialogue system built into the game. Not every option needs to carry deep meaning or consequences, but the player definitely shouldn't feel that disconnect, otherwise it works against our original goal. The next example is more substantial solutions that are entirely built on LLMs like AI Dungeon. They fix the second issue, the AI system being disconnected from actual gameplay, but they make the first one worse. And they show the problem I mentioned earlier even more clearly. Now the player can not only break their own immersion in the moment, their lines actually have real impact. By saying something out of place, they can completely derail the story, ruin the plot, ruin the world, because the AI has to somehow incorporate what was said into the lore. And now this will genuinely affect the narrative, clearly not for the better. That's the worst case scenario, but even in the best case, things are still pretty bleak. The story will most likely just become boring, because you can't be both an actor within the narrative and its creator at the same time. It completely removes any surprise element or challenge from the experience. A good way to understand how RPGs should actually work is to look at D&D, because at first glance it seems like the problem should already be solved there. The player truly can say and do literally anything, but in practice it doesn't always work the way you'd hope. If you play with a bad DM, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that total freedom by itself isn't a solution. A DM like that doesn't set boundaries or establish discipline in their group. They don't explain during character creation at session 0 which archetype would fit into the story and which character wouldn't mesh with the prepared plot. They don't control what's happening, and as a result, the players start acting foolishly and impulsively, burning down taverns, wandering into random empty forests, unreasonably killing and torturing important NPCs, and falling into Underdark through the first well they find. Sure, this could be fun in the moment, but wouldn't do in the grand scheme of things. Players could try to steer the story toward places where no content was ever planned, and moreover, where no content probably couldn't even exist given the logic and the lore of the world they're in. Not every action should be allowed and positively reinforced. Not every path should lead to the beneficial outcome. In some places, there's supposed to be nothing. If you look at the opposite case, a good DM at first glance does almost the same thing. They also give players freedom, allow and encourage roleplay, but at the same time they constantly, gently and invisibly keep the players inside the story they've prepared for them. They won't say no outright or break the player's immersion, but they might ask, "Are you sure you want to do that?" A good DM establishes from the start what level of thoughtfulness and coherence they expect from their players, and then consistently reinforces those expectations by letting actions have truly fair consequences. Do something reckless, and the world won't bend to protect you. Do something clever, and the world will reward you honestly. This keeps the table engaged rather than chaotic, and gives the DM the leverage to steer the group in a more meaningful direction. The DM will make sure that the players arrive at an important scene by properly motivating them, but won't just relocate content when the party has taken a wrong turn. And that's the key point. The player feels free, but the plot stays coherent and interesting. So a pre-written story crafted by actual writers remains a key inseparable part of any RPG. Story where certain places and characters are relevant by definition and others aren't. Some things are tied to the storyline and others are simply set dressing. One of the developer's jobs is to show where to look. You can't just hand the reins entirely to the player, or they'll wander off the edge of the game map and whine about where all the bosses are. But I also have to consider one of the main aspects of D&D, improvisation. A pretty large chunk of any game is made up of unscripted moments. Players approach a character who might have not been originally part of the plot, or they ask even a key character some unexpected question, and the game allows it and always presents some kind of answer. So you'd think this would push us towards the argument in favor of using artificial intelligence. After all, what I just described literally sounds like generating content on the fly. And this kind of thinking is exactly what gave us products like Mantella or AI Dungeon. And their performance hints that we're still not at a level of progress when you can trust any AI the way a DM trusts themselves while improvising. The context window available to the human brain still significantly exceeds those available to any artificial intelligence. Unlike current iterations of AI, a game master can be truly capable of fairly quickly generating an appropriate answer that will fit into the story without breaking it, and even more importantly, detecting and rejecting nonsense. So just as a good DM can't hand full control to the players, a self-respecting writer can't hand it to the AI either. Maybe one day we'll arrive in the wonderful future where the main plot stays crafted by a living author, while minor cosmetic and roleplay moments are handled by AI, but we're not there yet. AI has to be way better and very well behaved to be capable of achieving the same level of consistency and integrity. And this leads me to a conclusion. At least for now, fully or even partially uncontrolled solutions aren't viable, and the answer inevitably lies in authored content. We need pre-written player lines, pre-written world reactions, and pre-established story structure. It's just this pre-built pool needs to cover as broadly as possible everything the player might want to do. To achieve this, first of all, you have to write really well, and be very good at predicting the player's thoughts. It's genuinely a difficult task, and almost any game studio would struggle with it. There are just so many ways to make a mistake. Sometimes the issue is ambiguity, especially in games like Detroit Become Human or Dispatch, where the player sees only a short label on a button instead of the action line spoken or full description of the action taken. The player could think they're choosing one thing, but the character does something else, and the surprise isn't the result of the action, but the action itself. Sometimes the discretization is too crude. You effectively given be nice and be mean, when the space of reasonable reactions is obviously much richer than binary. Sometimes the coverage is uneven. The player is offered many options, but they're all variations of the same thing, when what they actually want is a completely different type of action. And sometimes the underlying choice is fine, but the specific phrasing is off. The option captures what the player wants to do in principle, but the exact wording feels unsuitable for their character, or hits the wrong tone, and picking it costs them a bit of immersion. This brings us back to what I said at the very beginning, because even accounting for those nuances, the question of quantity doesn't go away. No matter how well written, to reach true representativeness there just has to be more lines. Not necessarily dozens of new branches of dialogue or alternative endings that infinitely expand the game's structure, but at least making it more expressive, cosmetic variety, tone modulation, support for roleplay. What's funny is that adding more phrasings that lead to the same consequences isn't so hard. It's not super easy, but I'm only claiming that it's easier relative to many other tasks facing game developers, like 3D modeling, animating, or creating new gameplay mechanics. It's relatively a cheap task, even accounting for the combinatorial explosion where every line also needs testing, localization, and so on. And so a logical question arises. The problem of insufficient lines is obvious. It could and should be solved using specifically man-hour resources, and the amount of required resources doesn't seem too excessively great. Major companies definitely should have them. So why isn't this happening? Most likely, it's not because nobody thought of it or tried it. On the contrary, this idea has almost certainly been tested 100 times, and it turned out that in practice it doesn't work in a form that seems obvious. The existing, established in the industry ways of displaying dialogue simply aren't designed for that many options, and more importantly, players find it very hard to deal with. Imagine, at every dialogue fork you need to read through 10 to 15 options and choose from them. It slows down the game space incredibly and quickly becomes exhausting. At some point, it becomes simply unbearable, and most likely that point arrives in the very first scene. That's exactly why it's not done, not because it cannot be done, but because game developers deliberately limit choices to a small comprehensible set. Act 2. Not the lack of lines, but the very fact they are shown to us. There's also another problem which isn't talked about as much and is perhaps less obvious. I became especially acutely aware of it when I was watching the show You on Netflix. The main character was constantly getting into suspicious situations, and he quite often had to come up with convincing excuses on the fly to wriggle out and avoid trouble. In one such scene, when he managed to deliver an absolutely brilliant excuse in a split second and get away, I imagined myself in his place and realized I could never in my life have come up with something like that. And through this example, the second serious issue with RPGs becomes visible. When a game puts you in a similarly difficult position, you need to answer correctly in dialogue, you need to react quickly and cleverly in a scene, it immediately shows you the options, denying you the chance to think and test yourself. A strange thing happens. Those players who could actually have pulled off something similar on their own are robbed of the satisfaction of having figured it out themselves, because the game hands them this option on a silver platter. The sense of agency is lost. You don't feel like you found the solution, you just picked from options someone else prepared. And those players who wouldn't have thought of that option, they almost certainly had some idea of their own pop into their head, one that maybe even seemed pretty good to them, and maybe that idea was even on the list, but seeing a clearly stronger option right next to it, they'll probably abandon their original decision and pick the one that seems more effective. Or even if they are able to resist, you can imagine that unpleasant feeling of being wrapped into the fact that you have been outwitted by developers. And in practice, the ugly consequences of showing options openly go even further. It happens before the player even sees the dialog window. When developers know that a given option will obviously look like the worst choice on the list, there's very little incentive to write it at all. Why spend man-hours on a line nobody will pick? And so the less optimal, weirder, more personal variants get quietly cut from the pool before they're even written. The visible list doesn't just influence which option the player picks, it shapes which options get created in the first place, and the range of what's available shrinks accordingly. Also, game designers, having no way of checking whether you would have thought of the right way of dealing with the task at hand yourself, are nerfing the solutions with randomness. You are presented with a problem, then right away shown the most elegant answer, choose it, but then the game says, now roll the dice and let's see if it works. You don't have a guaranteed chance of success. I don't want to say that all randomness and all non-guaranteed chances are always bad. If you go back to look at tabletop games, experience shows how often failure turns out to be more interesting than success. But specifically here, the problem is something else. In D&D, for coming up with a perfect way of solving the problem, the DM would probably grant an automatic success and then reward you with an inspiration point, or at the very least give you advantage on the roll. But in the video game, you can't demonstrate your own cleverness, only the developers demonstrate theirs. There are no questionable solutions. The only right way was already hand-picked, discarding everything that could plausibly require rolling dice. And then there's the worst case of this whole pattern, skill-gated dialogue inserts. You know, the ones like persuasion, intimidation, intelligence, in square brackets sitting right there at the front of the line, telling you exactly which stat this option leans on. In a system like that, the element of choice essentially disappears. The player doesn't even have to read the lines, let alone think about which one fits their character or the situation. They just scan for the tag matching their highest stat and click it on autopilot. The roleplay isn't really happening during the game at all. It already happened, once, at the start, during character creation. Every dialogue line picked after that is just a consequence of that initial choice playing itself out. The entire game, which was supposed to be RPG, becomes a sequence of foregone conclusions. In fact, I have exactly the same complaint not only about skill-gated dialogue choices, but about the stat leveling system itself. It's just as pointless and illusory. When you choose a sorcerer class in Dark Souls, it's already predetermined into which stats and in what quantities points should be distributed. You could just as easily set the initial stat ratio, and only the multiplier will automatically change as you level. But enough about that. Let's return to discussing the classic RPG's problems. Act 3. The solution I see. So I arrive at the conclusion. Lines and actions should be pre-written along with their consequences, but they shouldn't be shown to the player directly. They should be hidden. Something partially similar already existed at the dawn of the gaming industry, in old text RPGs where the player typed command themselves. Go north, take the key, open the door, hit the monster with a sword. The idea itself was good. The player wasn't choosing from a list. They were genuinely formulating what they wanted to do on their own. But this system had a critical flaw. It forced the player to think not just about intent, but about phrasing. If you made a typo, the command didn't work. If you worded it slightly differently, it didn't work. If you wrote pick up the key instead of take the key, the game might simply not understand you. The player wasn't focused on finding a good solution within the world, but on trying to guess what exact string of words the system wanted to see. And worse still, you could never be sure whether the action you had in mind really didn't exist, or whether you just hadn't hit the right phrasing yet. You could try rephrasing the same thought 10, 15, 20 times, and in the end either find out it was never there, or, even more annoyingly, that it was, you just needed to write it some 21st way. In other words, the old text-based model was much closer to the right solution than people tend to think, but it broke down on overly literal command recognition. And this is where a truly intriguing possibility emerges. If you use algorithms that recognize not the exact string, but the player's intent, understanding the context of what was written, then this entire old problem stops being so scary. If the system understands that pick up the key, take the key, put the key in my inventory, and grab the key and stash it in my bag are all essentially the same action, then the player finally stops trying to guess the developer's phrasing. If their command doesn't work, they immediately understand that this cannot be done and won't try to rephrase it over and over. This solution is exactly what allows both declared problems to be solved at once, while avoiding every pitfall of the alternative approaches I went through earlier. Before, we couldn't afford to write 20 options because making the player read through 20 lines on every turn would have been unbearable. But if all those options are hidden and the player only sees the ones they themselves wanted to discover, the problem disappears. We can write 20 lines, We can write 50, every cosmetic variation, every tone, without overwhelming the player with a single unnecessary one. And since the player no longer sees the options in advance, they come up with what they want to do on their own. They're not choosing from a list. They're not seeing the good answers handed to them on a silver platter. Their own thinking kicks in, and the feeling that they are the one in charge comes back. And we no longer need to artificially weaken strong lines with randomness. If the player figured out a brilliant solution on their own, they deserve to be rewarded for it. And throughout all of this, the developers still retain control. All permissible actions exist in advance. All consequences are written. The story doesn't fall apart. The player doesn't get the infinite freedom to break the world. We're not handing the reins to them or to artificial intelligence. But they do get the ability to independently discover what was already there, instead of being pointed at it. Essentially, the right solution lies somewhere between classic RPGs with a visible list of options and the old text adventures with a rigid character-by-character parser. But there's an important nuance to keep in mind here. A visible list of lines doesn't only restrict the player, it primarily shows them what's possible. And in building system I've described, it's very important to make sure that before trying to come up with what they want to do, the player at least roughly understands what they can do. Of course, sooner or later, they'll feel out the boundaries on their own by testing which actions work and which don't. And for some personality types, there will be a certain pleasure in that. But from a game design perspective, it will be critically important that the direction where to aim, which way to think, is sufficiently obvious to the player. This is exactly what we're trying to do with Emerald Ferns. If the problems I've described resonate with you and the approach I've proposed seems appealing, I invite you to follow our development journal. We already have a working proof of concept for the core mechanic, even though the first stage of development was focused primarily on the visual engine. Spoiler, it's not an LLM-based solution and never will be, because the shortest possible latency you can achieve for this purpose with an LLM is 200 milliseconds, which is already uncomfortably noticeable. Also, with our algorithm, you won't need an additional 4 GB of video memory and in theory should be able to run it even on a calculator. Emerald Ferns has a minimalistic retro-inspired pixel art style, and I'll admit I worry about it. Pixel art doesn't travel well through social media. It gets blurred, compressed, and scaled wrong. Especially considering the smaller scale of individual pixels we settled on to be able to display the appropriate amounts of text on the screen. On top of that, the whole pitch of the game is something you have to play to feel. You can't really screenshot, the player came up with their own line and the world responded honestly. So the game is going to need more than the usual amount of visibility to reach the people who would actually enjoy what's underneath the wrapper. The flip side of minimalistic style, and the reason we chose it in the first place, is what makes this whole project possible and why you probably won't have to wait too long for a chance to actually play it. If you want for a game like Emerald Ferns to exist, please feel free to subscribe, hit like and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, I hope this finds you well.